Guide me, O the great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Feed me till I want no more. When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside. Bear me through the swelling current, land me safe on Canaan's side. Songs of praises, I will ever give to thee. I will ever give to thee. Be seated. Well, let's go ahead and get the retraction and correction out of the way first here. I have a commentary that I've been using in our Hebrews study, and this is on page number 428, if you want to look it up. Aristodres, Aristodes, Aristodus, the pagan orator, said of Christians, if they hear of anyone of their number in prison or in distress for the sake of Christ's name, they all render aid to them to his necessity, and if they can, they redeem him and set him free. I don't know if autocorrect changed my typing of Aristodes to Aristotle, but Todd Daly reminded me that Aristotle died like 300 or 400 years before Christ, and that was kind of impossible to come from him. But that is the correction, and so I realized that I had said Aristotle, and that was an impossibility. I saw several of you grab your phones and start looking that up, and you're allowed to correct me. That's just fine. And so I'm glad we got that out of the way. Okay, I need to very quickly choose 2 volunteers to come up and help me here this evening in an exercise we're going to do with the kids. So kids, this is what I need you to do. We're going to go with my wife's birthday. It's March 17th. If you have a birthday in March, stand up. If you have a birthday in March, stand up. Okay, if you have a birthday between March 10th and March 20th, keep standing. Between March 10th and March 20th. Do I have any more than these 2? Nolan and Josh. Nathan. Their birthday's on the same day. Are there any other kids that are standing? All right, what day is your birthday, guys? March 19th. Come on up then. All right? Give them a hand, all right? They are playing for lucky prizes here tonight, okay? All right? We'll set those on the table. I want to bring up my stopwatch here. Grab a seat there, guys, and look at these. Nolan, I know you're a Lego fanatic, and even Nathan, you're probably a Lego fanatic too. And I know that playing with Duplos is like a step down, like way down. I saw your Star Wars set that was like, 10,000 pieces, whatever. Okay, all right. Well, this is what we want to do tonight. I want you to build according to the pattern. So here is the pattern. We'll just set those over there. Here's the pattern. Hands on top of your head. This foundation piece does not have to be the same. I recognize that you have an orange one, you have a yellow one. You're not going to be disqualified because yours is a yellow one. but we're looking for the up from there. You're going to build according to it. I have a stopwatch here. When you're done building and you think you have it exactly to the pattern that is in front of you, I want you to push back from your chair and stand up. That's how we will know that you are done, okay? All right, you want to build according to the pattern. Are you guys ready? Let's count them down. We'll count down from 5. Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Ten seconds. Nolan is up. Keep building. Keep building.
Wait, what? Is that right?
All right. Let's take a look here, folks. Okay, I know you're looking from a little bit of a distance. They had the exact same pieces, the exact same colors. Do either of them match the pattern? No. Take it all apart, boys. Let's do it again. All right? Take it all apart. You have to build according to the pattern. Exactly. According to the pattern. Your foundation doesn't count. Okay? Your foundation doesn't count. It's from the blue block up. Okay? On top of your head. That was 22 seconds of wrong. All right. On top of your head, on top of your head. All right, here we go. 3, 2, 1, go. According to the pattern. According to the pattern. Nathan, you want to look again. You want to be according to the pattern, exactly like the color combination that is there in front of you.
Yes!
Stop here. I got 29.52 seconds. Let's check you out here, Nolan. All right. We got blue, yellow, red, green, yellow, red, red, blue, green, yellow. You may have your choice of pretzels or gummy bears. Going with gummy bears, you get pretzels. Very good. Have a good job. All right. This did have a reason, okay? All right. Ezra chapter 8, Ezra builds and goes and prepares to build, really, is what we should say, according to the pattern that God had put out. And this pattern of their leaving Babylon and going to the land of promise actually follows a little bit of the pattern that we see in the Exodus. And so we've been learning here in Ezra about their return to the promised land. We've been learning about how they rebuilt the temple. We saw in chapter 7, again, that the temple was completed, but it wasn't furnished. And in chapter 7, the reason for Ezra being sent back to Judea was to finish the furnishing of the temple, as it had already been completed, and then to bring the people back to the adherence to the law. Remember, I shared with you last time in Ezra that Artaxerxes wanted them to return and add another god to the mix, and if he was going to add this other god to the mix, then he wanted to make sure that the Judeans were practicing their religion rightly and weren't angering the gods. And so that was his reason for choosing Ezra and sending Ezra back. God was working in the backdrop, though. This wasn't just the decrees of kings. God was at work. I'll prove that to you from chapter 8 and verse number 18. Take a look real quick here. Then by the good hand of our God upon us. Okay, so Ezra states clearly there that God is the one who is at work. Look, if you can, over in chapter 8 and look at verse number 22, middle of the verse. The hand of our God was upon those for good who seek him. Again, God's hand at work. And then jump over to verse number 31. The hand of our God was upon us. Now, we've seen in the book of Ezra that verses 1 through 6 was this first return of the Judeans back to Judea. And then in chapter 7, we see the second return, and that is Ezra leading the second return to restore the temple, refurnish it, and practice the law as God had orchestrated it. The third return will be Nehemiah, who goes back to rebuild the walls. And so Ezra was chosen because he was devoted to God's word, and he was all about, I could say it that way, Israel's restoration. So Ezra had received this mandate from God, given through the king. Again, this isn't just king's decrees. This is a mandate that Ezra had from God that came through the king to ensure that the Judeans would observe God's law. Remember chapter 7, verse number 10. And that was that Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, to do it, and to teach statutes and ordinances in Israel. And so Ezra was one who was devoted to that. And he comes on the scene there in chapter 7 and then begins that journey. And we get details of that journey here in chapter 8. Now, why would the Judeans want to go back to Judea? You know, in this first return, about 42,000, 43,000 people in Ezra chapter 2 that came in this first return back to Judea. Here in chapter 8, that number anywhere from 5,000 could be up to 7,000. We get the number of the men at about 1,500, just a little bit under 1,500. And you know that they, no offense ladies, no offense children, but they didn't count ladies and children in their number of goings. And so it just kind of depended on the family sizes. But this is definitely a smaller group than the first group that went. Why do you think this second group is so reluctant to go? Or why do you think they didn't go with the first group? Well, I want you to think about this. This is people are returning after the exile, after their time in Babylon. They'd been in Babylon for 70 years. And they had been well established in their time in Babylon. And in Judea, there was not necessarily the promise of food. There was not necessarily the promise of lodging. There was not necessarily the promise of ease. And so they chose to stay back. And Ezra comes and makes up the plea for another group to return with him. And his purpose in going was simply this: to lead an exodus, if you will, in quotes there, as a part of the prophesied restoration of Israel. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, all had said what? It will be 70 years and you will go back. It is limited and you will go back. And so for the Judeans to get settled into Babylon is really for them to deny the prophecy that was given that you would return to the land of Israel. Now, this is kind of apropos to the world that we're in right now, okay? I saw somebody put on Facebook a map that said, in green, the country of Israel, and in red, all the Islamic nations around Israel. And this extends down into northern Africa and across the Middle East and north of Israel. And so you have all this red, and you have this little bit of green right in the middle of it. And Israel's the one that's being accused of occupying land that's not theirs. It's just out of proportion there just a little bit, map-wise. But this promise that was given here actually shows up in our news today. The land that Israel went back to was measured out specifically and was returned to Israel, and specifically as a capital, the hub of Jerusalem had to be restored first. That included their homes, that included the temple, and that included the wall. And God had a purpose in each one of these. If I can, I'm going to, because we're already over our time for our evening service here, I am going to summarize 7 key words out of chapter 8. And I'm going to need you to allow me to summarize just a little bit here tonight so that we can journey through this. I think these 7 words will be an encouragement to you. So if I could give you these 7 key words from chapter 8 and give them to you just one at a time, it'll give you the overview of details of the Judeans in the second return, the second exilic return to the promised land under Ezra. And we find out these key words that God gives. First of all, number 1, that is God desires faith to accept his second chances. Folks, can I just ask you tonight, are you glad that God is a God of second chances? I mean, if you just had to have, if we had to bat 1,000 on chance number one, would we, how many of us would be here? That God gave the opportunity for the first returners to go back to the land of Judea. Aren't you glad that God gave a second opportunity here under Ezra's leadership? Whether it's the coming of the gospel or commitment to Christ, or even in my own life, I can remember Brother Bob Fields preaching at a youth rally in Topeka, Kansas. I don't even know if I've ever told you this, but I can remember him preaching at a youth rally in Topeka, Kansas, and the invitation was given, and I grabbed the pew in front of me, and I held it till my knuckles were white. And I dug my heels in. I'm like, God, I'm not going forward. I'm not going forward. I'm not going forward in committing my life to Christ. Not talking about a salvation decision. I'm just talking about a surrender decision to Christ. And I was just digging my heels in. I grabbed the pew so much, I think in Stewart Baptist Church, is it Stewart Avenue Baptist Church there in Topeka, Kansas? I think I broke the pew, but I was not going forward. And I made it through the invitation. And I made it home to Kansas City. And I made it through a couple more months. And how do you think that went? You know, finally, I'd fought God enough that he was going to leave me alone, right? Why are you laughing? It's not the case. It's not the case. Because God is a God of second chances. Now I realize in God's sovereignty, there's not chance number one, there's not chance number two, there's not chance number three, that God sovereignly is over all of these things, that he doesn't go from plan A to plan B, or from plan B to plan C, or he doesn't fall into Dave Teppenkamp Brown, or we're already down to D or E or F. But God in here, what he does is he has this first group that goes, and then he says, okay, Ezra, you're going to lead another group. If you add up the math there from verses 1 through 14, you come up with 1,496 men that responded to the call of God to return to Israel. And I want you to notice here, if you can there, from verse number 2, that you have two distinct lineages that are mentioned here. First of all, you have the sons of Phinehas. Okay, so that would be the Levitical line. You remember the priests of Levi had to be represented in some way, shape, or form. If you're going to have a temple, you're not going to have a very good temple if you don't have Levites. So that had to be represented in there in some way, shape, or form. And then you had David also mentioned there. And again, that's the royal line. Okay. Now this is not King David. Okay, but this is another David in the Old Testament. But this mention of David connects back to this royal line, this messianic line. And so you have the priestly line and the messianic line, or the royal line, that are both represented in this calling of these men to return back to the land of Judea. This shows up again if you go all the way over to verse number 35, where you have the 12 tribes of Israel represented in 12 families that are symbolizing the 12 tribes that sacrifice 12 bulls and sacrifice 12 goats, along with other animals that we'll mention here in a moment. But again, you have this encompassing of all of Israel is in this remnant that's going back. All of Israel is represented. It's not just that God said, okay, hey, you have one chance. If you didn't go back with the first, too bad, so sad. No, he keeps calling his people to himself, and we have a collective that's resulted in the very end. So if you want the key word here, it would be the word of God gives, two words here, second chances. That God gives second chances. Number two, the second word there would be the idea of God being the one who desires sacrifice or sacrifice. And so in verses 15 through 20, what happens is Ezra gathers this group down by the river, okay? And while they're there, they start to count up everybody who's there, and look at the end of verse number 15, and found none of the sons of Levi there. So while you have Phinehas, who's representing the lineage of the Levites, you don't actually have a Levite that is there. It's going to be a problem. You're going back to the temple and you got no Levites. And so what does Ezra do? Ezra requests more Levites to join him there in verses 15 through 17. And the number was so small that what he does is he sends out 9 leaders and 2 teachers to go back and appeal for more to come. Now, why were these Judeans so slow to leave Babylon and to go back to Israel? Again, okay, no homes, no really furnished temple, no wall. And we already knew from chapter 7 that there was oppression to those who were there. This was a long journey. They were settled in. And you remember from our series in Numbers, you remember this? That if you're a Levite, how much of the land is actually allotted to you? It rhymes with hero, and it starts with a Z. Exactly, 0. You don't really get any of the land, do you? So why leave your posh little estate back in Babylon with the hanging gardens to go to this desolate area where you don't even know what you're going to have there, and you don't even really have a furnished temple anyway. But the appeal comes, and what happens? The good hand of God brings success. And in verses 18 through 20, what happens? There are men that are gathered that are Levites, specifically named there are these specific men, and Sherebiah and his 18 brothers, Hashabiah, and he comes with sons, 20 men with him, and you have this collective that's gathered now. And all of these were designated by their name. That's the end of verse number 20. All of them come together. And this is not because of their great persuasion and going back and saying, hey, would you reconsider coming back with us? It's going to be great. We're going to the promised land. No. Verse number 18, then by the good hand of our God upon us. God's work. And this sacrifice of leaving their posh village, if you will, in Babylon to go back to the land of Judea. Number 3, we have a dependence on God for deliverance. That would be the key word there, deliverance. This is found in verses 21 through 23. So they're at this river and they're about ready to embark upon this journey. And what does Ezra do first? Well, look at verse number 21. Then I proclaimed a fast there by the river Ava, and that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek him the right way for us, for our little ones, and all of our possessions. For I was ashamed to request from the king an escort of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemies of the road, and because we had spoken to the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all those for good who seek him, but his power and his wrath are against all those who forsake him. So we fasted and entreated our God for this, and he answered our prayer. You see something amazing here, okay? Here's Ezra's travel plans. Fast, pray, and then journey. Now, a lot of people, I read a couple commentaries that said that this passage, Ezra is doubting God. Ezra is doubting God because he didn't go and ask for a soldier escort to kind of fend off the enemies. And he says, well, maybe I should have, but I didn't. I don't think Ezra is doubting God here. I think Ezra is thinking on human level, yes, I could have gone to the king and I could have asked for some soldiers to go with us. But instead what we did was we fasted and prayed and we determined that God would be our protection. God would be our deliverance and on the way. And what did God do? God answered that prayer. So Ezra didn't give a petition to the king for the king's protection. His goal was to bring Israel and the Jews in full dependence into God and God alone. And he did that by instituting a fast and a prayer, a time of fasting and a time of prayer before the journey, so that their focus would be on God and God's deliverance, and not on, hey, we made it safe because the king's army was riding with us. You see a similar thing that comes out in other places in the Old Testament, where again, God says, no, you're going to go with just me, and I will be your protection. I will be your deliverer. Number 4, the key word here is the word sanctified. So in order to serve God, we must be sanctified, holy, and pure. In verses 24 through 30, again, Ezra is going back to furnish the temple, and so they're journeying with the things to furnish the temple. And so what he does is Ezra appoints a group of 12 priests to guard the king's or the temple's treasures, okay, that are going back. And look at verse number 24. You find out that they were separated, and I separated. That's the idea of sanctified, to set something apart. I separated 12 of the leaders of the priests, and he lists them. And in verse number 28, he tells them, he said to them, you are holy to the Lord. Again, that's the idea of sanctified, separated as holy to the Lord. And he tells them that they're holy there in verse number 28. And he tells them their job in verse number 29. Watch and keep them until they weigh before the leaders of the priests and the Levites. Okay, you have to keep your eyes and you watch over these temple treasures because they're going to the temple. Okay? Now, I'll tell you a little bit later on how much they were watching. It's actually listed out here in gold, silver vessels, and these furnishings that they carried with them, how much it all weighed to. And you can kind of see the parental kids. Have mom and dad done this one to you? You know? This is Ezra to these priests that were chosen to watch over the temple treasures. He's like, hey guys, keep your eye on that. Keep your eye on that. Your job is to watch this. Because when we get to Judea, they're going to count it all up, and it better match. It better match. When I was first getting on board at Walnut Ridge Baptist Church in Waterloo, Iowa, they had just come off a time when one of the financial people that was serving financially at the church had just embezzled thousands of dollars from the church. And just under the radar had stolen thousands and thousands of dollars from the church. And they were just coming off that when I came on board as their youth pastor. And there was a little bit of trust that had to be rebuilt, and a little bit of some of that organizing and orchestrating and accountability in that. And so Ezra is watchful over those things, puts people as watchful over those things, separates and sanctifies them as holy to watch those things. And he stressed that those things were intended for God's use in God's temple, there in verses 28 and 29. Word number 5, that is the idea of being grateful for God's deliverance. Grateful for God's deliverance. Verse number 31 through 32, they departed, crossed the river on the 12th day of the month to go to Jerusalem, and the hand of our God was upon us, there's that phrase again, and delivered us from the hand of our enemies and from the ambush along the road. And so we came to Jerusalem and stayed there 3 days. It appears that Ezra moved this crowd along pretty quickly, all right? Because when they get there, they rest for 3 days once they get there, okay? But what does he say? He says, God protected us from our enemies and from any ambushes. God was our protection. God was our deliverance. He was the one who watched over us during our time of our journey. And that comes out there in verses 31 through 32. And then number 6 here, the idea of being accountable. Be accountable to maintain your integrity before God. Verses 33 through 34. Again, he told these 12 men to watch the temple treasures. And then when they got to Jerusalem, they were all brought out and they were all counted up. Okay? And verse number 34, and the number of the weight of everything, and all the weights were written down at that time. Everything matched. Now look what this was, okay? If a talent weighed about 75 pounds in our modern day, okay, then these Levites that were chosen to guard the gold that was weighing approximately 7,500 pounds of gold that they were carrying, silver weighing approximately 48,750 pounds, not a light load of silver, okay? And then silver vessels weighing about 7,500 pounds. And they add it all up in the end, and it all adds up exactly. Right to the down to the very last talent, okay? Exactly down to what they began with. It's the idea of accountability and integrity. And so they present to God exactly what they were given to bring to God. And then lastly, number 7, demonstrate your love for God through worship. Look at verses 35 through 36. And the children of Israel and those of those who had been carried away captive, who had come from the captivity, offered burnt offerings to God of Israel, 12 bulls for all of Israel, 96 rams, 77 lambs, and 12 male goats as sin offerings, and all of the burnt offerings, all of this was a burnt offering to the Lord. Capital Lord, Tetragrammaton, the unspoken name of God. And they delivered the king's orders to the king's satraps and all the governors in the region by the river, and so they gave the report to all the people and the house of God. And so there is an idea of worship that takes place here. Now I recognize, compared to the sacrifices that we saw in chapter 4, this is small fries, okay? I mean, remember the hundreds and hundreds of animals that were dedicated in that time of worship? But Ezra oversees the exiles' offering of sacrifices of worship to God. You have 12 bulls and you have 12 male goats, again representing all the 12 tribes of Israel. 96 rams and 77 lambs, and those were tied to 2 different Levitical promises. And even though it appears that the 77 lambs tied in a little bit to the Passover, and Israel did not continue in keeping the Passover as they should have, there was that time, intertestamental time, and the Passover became nonchalant, if I could say it that way. Each of these things were sacrificed wholly to the Lord. And it reminds me of what the kids sang about here at the beginning of the service, and I didn't plan that. That was the song they chose, but it fit right into what I wanted to end with here tonight, and that's Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And that is the providence of God, and that is the working of God, and that is the hand of God that is seen through Ezra chapter 8, leading us to consider our lives as well, as God desires us to have a spiritual return to God, a spiritual rebuilding in our lives, and a spiritual renewal in our lives, all pictured in those exact same words of God's providence, God's deliverance, God's worship, God's provision. All those things become realities in our life as well, as we follow the exact same pattern. I know we're not packing up to move to the promised land. We're not making a journey out of a time of exile into a time of being post-exilic or returning to our homeland or whatever the case may be. But spiritually speaking, isn't the exact same exodus that took place at the cross of Calvary? We were captives to our sin, and we were set free by the blood of Jesus Christ. And so that spiritual journey includes all those exact same words, and I pray that that has been an encouragement to you here this evening. Father, thank you again for these truths. Thank you for the opportunity to walk through them. Thank you for the guy's illustration of building according to the pattern and Ezra's commitment to that pattern and how we see that pictured here in